Herkese merhabalar. Tüm katılımcılarımız, panel üyelerimiz hoş geldiniz. Değerli vaktinizi bize ayırdığınız için çok teşekkür ederiz. AB Avrupa Birliği İklim Diplomasisi Haftası kapsamındaki İklim Adaleti UNDP'nin düzenlediği İklim Adaleti webinarına hoş geldiniz. Programımızı zaten sizlerle hepinizle paylaştık. Öncelikle konuşmacılarımızla, panel üyelerimizle onların sunumlarıyla devam edeceğiz. Sonrasında bir soru-cevap zamanımız olacak. Orada da değerli görüşlerinizi, ileriye yönelik önerilerinizi, panel üyelerine sorularınızı alacağız. Ondan sonra da bitireceğiz. Yaklaşık 1,5 saat kadar sürmesini bekliyoruz. Tekrar ben teşekkür ederim katılımlarınız için. Şimdi UNDP temsilci yardımcımız Sayın Seher Alacacı-Arıner konuşmasıyla devam edeceğiz. Buyurun Seher Hanım.
Teşekkür ediyorum Orhun. Çok kıymetli katılımcılar. Ben de herkesi UNDP Türkiye adına hoş geldiniz demek istiyorum. Sevgiyle selamlıyorum. Öncelikle sözlerime başlamadan önce bize bugün vakit ayıran değerli panelistlerimize de çok teşekkür etmek istedim. Hepinizin bildiği üzere büyük hedefler güden iklim eyleminin küresel iki savunucusu olan Avrupa Birliği ve UNDP Türkiye temsilcileri iklim değişikliği risklerine karşı kırılganlıklarımızı azaltmanın önemini vurgulamak amacıyla ortak bir kampanyayı başlattılar. AB İklim Diplomasi Haftası kapsamında gerçekleşen bir dizi faaliyetimiz oldu. Bugün de sizlerle birlikte yine aynı kampanya kapsamında iklim adaletini tartışıyor olacağız. İklim değişikliği sadece bir çevre sorunu değil, aynı zamanda ekonomik ve sosyal bir sorun, bir insan hakları sorunu. İklim değişikliğinin insanlar, özellikle de kırılgan gruplar üzerindeki etkisi çok büyük. Başta sağlık olmak üzere insan hakları ve sosyoekonomik çerçevede büyük etkileri var ve iklim değişikliğinin sebebiyle mağdur olanlar ve yaşamları alt üst olanların sayısı da gitgide artmakta. Yine aynı grup bu mağdurları seslerini duyurma, çözüm üretme ve karar alma süreçlerine katılmada da zorluklar yaşamaktadırlar. Bu nedenlerden dolayı iklim krizinin ülkeler tarafından bütüncül, katılımcı ve şeffaf bir şekilde ele alınması ve bu şekilde değerlendirilmesinin gerekliliği ortaya çıkmaktadır. Paris Anlaşması da yine bu noktada iklim değişikliğinin insanların ortak sorunu olduğunun altını çizerek tarafların iklim değişikliğine müdahale amaçlı eyleme geçtiklerinde insan hakları çerçevesindeki yükümlülüklerine uygun hareket etmeleri, insan haklarını korumaları ve teşvik etme yönünde çalışmalar yaptığının önemini ortaya koymuşlardır. Sürdürülebilir kalkınma için 2030 gündemi de yoksullukla, eşitsizliklerle ve gezegenimizin sağlığını tehdit eden problemlerle etkin bir mücadele etmek için hareket etmeyi teşvik etmektedir. Birleşmiş Milletler Genel Sekreteri Antonio Guterres, İklim değişikliğine bağlı olarak kuraklık, sel, ekstrem hava olaylarından doğan tehditlerin uzun yıllar devam edeceğine ve eylemlerin süreklilik gerektirdiğine dikkat çekmiştir. İnsanların mağduriyetini engellemek ve şimdiki ve gelecek nesillerin insan haklarını korumak için acilen eyleme geçmesi gerekmektedir. İklim adaleti kapsamında geliştirilebilecek politikalar ve yaratıcı stratejiler yine sürdürülebilir kalkınma amaçlarının hepsine doğrudan veya dolaylı olarak hizmet etmektedir. Bunlardan ilk aklımıza gelen ikinci amaç açlığa son, üçüncü amaç sağlıklı ve kaliteli yaşam, beşinci amaç toplumsal cinsiyet eşitliği ki son dönemde hem Türkiye'de hem de dünyada ciddi bir gerilemenin olduğunu söylemek mümkün. 7. amaç erişilebilir ve temiz enerji, eşitsizliklerin azaltılması, iklim eylemi 13. amaç, 16. eylem barış, adalet ve güçlü toplumlar. Aslında bütün sürdürülebilir kalkınma amaçlarının temelini oluşturan bir amaç bu ve aynı şekilde yine amaçlar için ortaklıkları güçlendirmeyi hedeflediğimiz 17. Sürdürülebilir kalkınma amaçları da yine iklim için adalet alanındaki politika ve stratejilere yedirilmesi gereken alanlar arasında yer alıyor. İklim kriziyle mücadelede çevresel ve sosyal adalet, eşitsizliklerin giderilmesi ve gelecek nesillerin mutlu bir şekilde yaşamlarını sürdürebilmesi için büyük önem taşımaktadır. Burada iklim adaleti ve bu konsept çerçevesinde çevre yönetişimi de ön plana çıkmaktadır. Bu toplantıda sizlerin de katılımıyla, yine panelistlerimizin de katkısıyla iklim adaletini bütüncül bir şekilde ele almak istiyoruz. Özellikle uluslararası ve ulusal alanda hukukun etkisi, döngüsel ekonomi, yerel yönetimler ve sivil toplum kuruluşlarının önemi ve sürece katkısı, enerji sektörünün etkisi, iklim adaletinde cinsiyet eşitliği ve uluslararası örnekleri tartışmayı hedefliyoruz. İklim mücadelesinde çok sektörlü bir yaklaşımın daha kapsamlı stratejiler ve politikalar geliştirilmek için gerektiğine inanıyoruz. Bu çerçevede yapılacak işbirlikleri ve atılacak adımlar daha etkili olacak ve kalıcı çözümleri de beraberinde getirecektir. İklim adaleti, toplumsal farkındalık anlamında da iklim eylemi çerçevesinde ciddi katkılar sağlayacaktır. UNDP, dünyada iddialı bir iklim eyleminin küresel savunucularından bir tanesidir. Eylül 2019 yılında Birleşmiş Milletler İklim Eylemi Zirvesi'nde UNDP İklim Sözü programını başlatmıştır. Türkiye'de bu programın içerisinde yer alan 100 ülkeden bir tanesidir. Biz de bu kapsamda yeni işbirlikler kurarak Türkiye'nin iklim mücadelesinin ne katkılarını arttırmaya devam etmeyi hedeflemekteyiz. Bugün harekete geçmememiz, bugünkü eşitsizlikleri arttırırken gelecek nesillerin insan haklarını ihlal etmemiz anlamına geliyor. Kırılgan ve etkilenebilir bireylerin, toplumları iklim değişikliğine etkilerinden ve çevre kirliliğini korumak sadece ahlaki değil, aynı zamanda toplumsal bir sorumluluk, hepimizin sorumluluğu. Hep birlikte iklim adaleti için harekete geçmemiz gerekiyor. Çünkü iklim biziz ve değişeceğiz. Herkese ilgisinden ve katkısından dolayı şimdiden çok teşekkür ediyorum ve iyi bir toplantı geçmesini diliyorum. Teşekkürler.
Seher Hanım, çok teşekkür ederiz ilham verici konuşmanız için. Dilerseniz şimdi panelistlerimizin sunumlarıyla devam edebiliriz. İlk baştaki panelistimiz Kirsten Mierschart. Kendisi Hollanda Helsinki Komitesi İnsan Hakları Savunma Programı Müdürü. 12 yılı aşkın süredir kendisinin uluslararası ilişkiler ve uluslararası hukuk anlamında tecrübesi var. Uluslararası Ceza Mahkemesi Koalisyonu da çalışmıştır kendisi. Çevre hukuku, uluslararası çevre hukuku, Ekosid, uluslararası hukuk, özel hukuk, bunlar hep bütüncül olarak yaklaşılması gereken konular ve bu konuların uzmanı kendisi. Bizim davetimizi kabul ettiği için çok teşekkür ederim kendisine bir kez daha ve sunumuyla sizi baş başa bırakıyorum. Kendisi uluslararası global trendleri, Ekosid dediğimiz bilerek çevreye zarar verme, bunun bir hak ihlali olup Roma statüsüne eklenmesi, entegrasyonu gibi konularla çok ilgili ve özellikle uluslararası platformda ve yerel platformlarda sivil toplum kuruluşlarının rolü ve nereye kadar zorlayabilir, iklim adaleti fenomenini ve konsepti kapsamında gibi bu konularla ilgili. Ben daha fazla sözü uzatmadan, Kirsten, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you to UNDP Turkey for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be with you today. I'm going to try to share my screen so that you can see this presentation that I put together. I hope it is working well. So as was just mentioned, there's quite a laundry list of things I could discuss today, but I want to frame my points in the efforts that have really been driven by civil society to seek justice for the negative impact on the climate. There are other speakers in today's event who will go into more detail as to the origins and composition of the climate justice movement, but I do want to frame the examples I will give today with that, as it really has been very much citizen-led. They have pushed the envelope to seek justice much more so than governments or the private sector. And much of the impetus for this people's movement comes from the recognition of the intimate connection we all share with our natural world. And this has been so beautifully conceived and articulated primarily by indigenous communities, as you can see with the brief poem I put on the screen. Climate change disproportionately affects indigenous communities, and not only because their lands have the majority of the world's biodiversity, but because of this intimate connection that they have experienced, they have long recognized the urgent need to not only respect our environment, but to do proactive actions to protect it. This rallying cry to treat the natural world with utmost care has been taken up by people the world over, as I mentioned earlier, really from grassroots movements. that have contributed to what's known as the global climate justice movement. And they are increasingly finding new ways to push governments and the international community to take action to protect the environment. So today, I want to talk about a few of the exciting initiatives to come out of this citizen-led movement, focusing in particular on climate legislation, climate litigation, and climate accountability. Before doing so, though, I think it's important to underline a basic but important difference in interpretation when we use the term climate justice. The first, most common usage is when we seek to take an action to diminish the worst effects on the environment occurring as a result of our everyday actions. So, for example, addressing carbon dioxide emissions, our over-reliance on fossil fuels, industrial agriculture, air travel, fast fashion, etc. The second interpretation is linked to accountability for environmental crimes. And here we're looking more at a willful damage to the environment. And I'm thinking in particular, for example, of a company that is trying to cut costs. So instead of safely disposing of toxic waste, the company dumps it in a pristine forest. Those would be instances of an environmental crime. And this is a very important distinction because the avenues that have been explored to obtain climate justice may differ based on these differing interpretations. Excuse me. So when we look at climate legislation or the rights of nature, there are currently more than 200 international environmental agreements, which set out obligations for primarily governments to protect biodiversity, the ecosystem, the marine environment, the atmosphere, as our host mentioned earlier, sustainable development, but also the use of chemicals and, as I mentioned, the disposal of waste. Yet most of those agreements place the emphasis on the responsibilities of states rather than on the rights of people and the rights of the environment itself. And that's why these two examples on the screen are particularly interesting. Both Ecuador's constitution and Bolivia's law reflect the demand of ordinary citizens to have our ecosystems recognized as having rights, just as human beings have rights. And these are groundbreaking because they set the stage for the ecosystems themselves to be named as an injured party with their own legal standing rights in cases alleging rights violations. So we see here with Ecuador that the Constitution is recognizing inherently the right of nature and what that entails. And Bolivia's law also recognizes the rights of Mother Earth as a whole. We also see this approach with rights of nature being applied to specific parts of ecosystems, such as waterways. And here on the screen now, you see a couple of examples where, again, the initiative put forward by indigenous communities, grassroots people's movements, or non-governmental organizations has led to the recognition of rivers as having their own rights. We see in Colombia that the Atrato River was recognized as having rights. In New Zealand, the indigenous Maori community were able to secure similar recognition of the Wanganui River. In Bangladesh, we have this with Turog, and in the United States, most recently, in fact, just last month, citizens voted to provide rights to 2 rivers in the state of Florida. Now, most of you will have heard of Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish student who rose to fame as an international climate activist when she began a weekly school climate strike in 2018. And as we move from climate legislation to climate litigation discussions, we see that many climate cases have been related to greenhouse gases, as noted in the quote, and to carbon dioxide emissions. For example, Greta is among 16 youth activists from 12 countries who have an ongoing legal complaint before the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, seeking the government action on the climate crisis. But there are many more examples of such climate litigation. For example, I have 3 here on the screen that I want to highlight for you, partly because of the groundbreaking nature of these actual cases. The Urgenda case here in the Netherlands started in 2013, and a final ruling following appeal was only delivered last year, 2019. The plaintiffs in this case, yet again a grassroots civil society movement, argued before the courts of the Netherlands that by not meeting a minimum carbon dioxide emission reduction goal that had been set by scientists to avert harmful climate change, that the Dutch government was actually endangering the human rights of Dutch citizens as set out in national and European Union law. And in 2019, when, as I said, following appeal, the case finally reached the Supreme Court of the Netherlands, the court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, stating that the Dutch government had not taken sufficient action to prevent what they saw as a foreseeable harm, and that they were actually knowingly exposing its own citizens to danger. This case is groundbreaking because it marked the first time that such a high-level court established a state's duty to significantly and immediately reduce emissions in line with human rights obligations. The second example on the screen is the case of Juliana versus the United States of America. And this case started in 2015, where 21 young people filed a suit against the United States government and individual government administration officials. They argued that the government had knowingly violated their due process right to life, liberty, and property, as well as their sovereign duty to protect public grounds, by the very fact that they were encouraging and permitting the combustion of fossil fuels. Now, this case is still pending appeal, but it is groundbreaking to note that in 2016, the then presiding judge declined to dismiss the case and also ruled that access to a clean environment is a fundamental right. And the final example on the screen, which is really a first in the European Court of Human Rights' history, and some of you may be aware of this development. In September of this year, again, it really was a movement of the youth, with 6 children and young adults from Portugal, ranging in age from 8 to 21. They filed an application before the European Court against 33 member states of the Council of Europe. This includes all EU member states, the UK, Switzerland, Norway, Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey. And the case alleges that those states have not taken address to address the profound, ongoing, and worsening impact that climate change is having upon young people in particular. So already, this case was launched in September of this year, but already we have heard from the court that they have communicated with the 33 states addressed in the application and have called on them to respond to the application by February of next year, due to the urgency of the topic. So it's, again, quite groundbreaking in terms of development in litigation. But then moving on to what I've been calling climate accountability. And this is not to say that the legislation nor the litigation examples that I gave are not indications or examples of accountability. But here I want to talk to that second interpretation of climate justice that I started off in my presentation. The idea that there are certain crimes that have been infringed in relation to the environment in a willful manner with intent, and that this needs to be addressed and brought to justice. So this movement here to seek international criminal accountability for willful destruction of the environment finds its inspiration in existing international criminal law and the international criminal justice system, and by which I'm referring to, in particular, the International Criminal Court and its treaty, the Rome Statute. So supporters of defining a new international crime to address this willful destruction of the environment are, see Ekosid, which is the sort of working title of the crime, as a crime against peace, because the risk of or the actual extensive damage to or destruction of an ecosystem can lead to grave breaches of human rights, a heightened risk of conflict, and a significant decrease in the quality of life, health, and well-being of all inhabitants. And here on your screen, you see a proposed working definition for ecocide, that was proposed by a barrister from the United Kingdom, Polly Higgins, who sadly passed away in 2019, but which has really taken up steam, if you will, in moving forward. And in that respect, I want to round off my presentation by referring to the avenues for seeing a crime such as ecocide actually see the light of day in an international setting. So first, there are movements to extend the existing jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court was officially established in 2002, and it has jurisdiction over 4 international crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. Now, within there are some provisions to address damage to the environment in the situation of conflict, and that would be under war crimes. But the treaty would need to be amended to fully encompass the understanding behind ecocide as encapsulated in the definition I showed. And not only would that already raise quite a lot of difficulty because amending an international treaty takes time, but there's questions as to whether the International Criminal Court is really the right place to be addressing this very important issue, partly because membership of the court is not universal. Not all states of the world are members of the ICC. The court's already facing quite a lot of challenges in relation to adjudicating its current crimes within its jurisdiction, the 4 crimes I mentioned previously. And it's also subject to a number of political debates as to how independent an institution it is, as to the selectivity of cases. So it might not be the best avenue for exploring this new field of climate accountability. So another option would be to create an entirely new international jurisdiction, to create a new court. This is going to mean a lot of work. It took a very long time for the International Criminal Court to be created. Some of you may be aware that the idea actually was born out of the aftermath of World War II, and yet the court was only established in 2002. So it could be a very long road indeed to find the political will to establish a new international jurisdiction, particularly given that ecocide and environmental crimes in general also implicate quite often businesses and companies. And we know how powerful those actors are because of their economic strength. Regardless of that, a new court would also have other complications. The fact that ecocide as yet has to be defined and agreed upon by the international community. It's not a part of customary international law, which is usually what is needed before you can get enough buy-in from states to create an international mechanism. So the lack of political will is really there. The final point on my slide that I do want to share is that despite all of these rather negative obstacles that I've prefaced in the discussion on ecocide and a new international jurisdiction for climate accountability, is that just this past month, there's been an initiative to establish an international expert drafting panel that is going to look into actually determining a definition for ecocide that would then be not only possible to use for a new court or an extension of the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, but also could serve as to inspire national governments in terms of establishing national legislation. So I will end there for now to just give you this brief overview of some of the initiatives that have been taking place to seek climate justice. And I very much look forward to the conversations with you and any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Actually, I have a question, if you may. Now, if ecocide is some way, somehow integrated into the Rome Statute, would that affect the status of climate refugees? Thinking the perspective of 1951 Convention and international litigation and regulations.
That's a great question. And I certainly think that the proponents of expanding the jurisdiction of the ICC would want the definition of ecocide to be as all-encompassing as that, to ensure that climate refugees have recourse to justice if their need for asylum can be proven to be caused by willful destruction of the environment and the impact on the climate. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So now we're going to continue with our second panelist. That's Mr. Sheikh Eskender. He's from the Grantham Institute of London School of Economics. He's an economist and he's an academician. He's a microeconomist practitioner, and he also had research in terms of climate case litigation, circular economy, and what type of policies could be developed in terms of economic developments like green economy. And he will share us his research and the information that he gathered along the process of his research. So the floor is yours, Mr. Sheikh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Orhun. Thank you, Karsten and Seher, for your really interesting discussion around this very important topic. One interesting observation or experience, I guess you all will agree with me, whenever something else happens, like the ongoing pandemic is, making our life really difficult, we always take a step back on climate. So most of the times it's the second most important issue, but you can see the pattern. This is a continuous second most important issue, meaning actually this is something we always need to prioritize irrespective of what is going on in real world or in your daily life. And the reason, well, it's self-explanatory. We have that Paris Agreement. We need to limit our emission and we need to act as in order to reduce emissions, and that actions must be undertaken by not just policymakers or governments. Also, citizens or public sectors need to do something. The first thing that always comes to our mind is what's the problem we are going to face if we act on climate change or reducing emissions and all those things on economic growth or income. Now, Karsten used those examples or quotations from Greta and other environmental activists. Something we also really consider in our investigation, should we consider these two as contradicting each other, or there is a way to find, or there we can find a way to see if economic growth or income generation can be separated from emission. And that's something is highly important in order to achieve sustainable development goals, which is related to what we call is circular economy. And here, based on my and our other colleagues' research, some findings I just want to share with you people and others who participated here, and including the impacts that those climate change legislations can have on both emissions reductions and GDP growth. The first thing, just to reassure, there are some significant impacts those climate change legislations that almost all countries in the world are now undertaking have on country level CO2 emissions reductions, which is a really good thing. There's some worry as well, including concentration of more effective laws or practices in relatively developed countries. And we found something intuitively justifiable thing. Countries with strong institutional framework actually have better enforcement of laws and regulations, and they are performing way better than relatively weaker institutions, meaning most of the developing countries. And there's this possibility of carbon leakage, exporting your emission to another country, meaning say you stop producing commodities in your country, rather those dirty commodities can be produced in a different country and then you buy them back. So you are actually transferring emission from one to another country. Now, the role of institutions in reducing country level emissions is really important, and international institutions can take care of, at least partially, or reduce these global avoidance of emissions by transferring those emissions to relatively developing countries or poorer countries. And that's something probably will be a next big thing to investigate. Few things comes along here. When you are talking about climate legislations, we also need to carefully consider that potential or highly debated trade-off between environment and economy. Definitely, economic system or production system is energy intensive, or it uses energy. Now the problem or the question will become, does it have to be fossil fuel, or is there a way to phase out dirty fossil fuel and increase the use of renewables? When this is the big issue, which it is, and evidence says it doesn't really matter you are using energy from renewable or fossil fuel source, your income can remain at the same level, then phasing out fossil fuel is not going to have effect on economic growth, at least in the long run. That's something really positive news for renewable energy, because we can say without much hesitation that if other things are okay, then renewables can actually replace in the long run all the fossil fuel sources, and economic growth will not be adversely affected because of those renewable adoptions. Now, some problems when it comes to socio-economy or socio-economic impacts of legislations and litigations. You see, some of the legislations can remain really ineffective, like although, for example, some countries like Brazil and Indonesia have lots of climate change legislations, but we can see what's happening in Amazonia and what's happening in terms of forest degradation in Indonesia. But these are among the most prolific legislators in the world. The reason, multiple reasons we can identify. I mean, political orientation and prioritization of social issues, including environmental rights or climate justice, by government is really important when you are assessing exactly why a country is successful in reducing emissions and other environmental degradation indicators, while although they have many climate legislations in place. You can then take climate litigation as more of a strategic action by citizens. Nowadays, people or civil society or citizens are more aware of the harms of climate change because we are more directly facing these problems than maybe 20 or 30 years ago or 50 years ago. The problems is not just rising temperature or rising sea level, also climate-induced or environmental degradation-induced migration. And all these things together are now faced by most global citizens or most citizens in developed countries as well, meaning people who can voice their opinion now know the problems. Not only the indigenous communities who were actively participating in climate actions, now also relatively civilized communities are also participating in these actions. Even if most of the litigations are or were not successful officially, because Karsten hinted briefly exactly why they cannot be successful in most of the cases. But the strategic reason, I will say, will be still successful in achieving more recognition, more awareness, and in future we hope that more climate litigation will be put forward, and more environmental accountability will be there through citizens' participation in climate action, actively and directly. And here comes the relation or linkage between legislation and litigation, because although there's no statistical relationship been established so far, but anecdotal evidence pretty much establishes that with legal framework being supported towards citizens acting or putting forward some litigation actions, then these litigations actually become more commonplace. And these litigations are not just about protecting biodiversity or environmental resources, also about your own or citizens' own property rights or quality of their own resources. So this information or awareness will be really important in making all three parties in the economy, private sector, citizens, and government, active in this fight against this demon called climate change. And hopefully we will be able to replace fossil fuel by renewables, and then the curse of growth in terms of consequent emissions probably will be reduced, or hopefully in the very long run will go away. So thank you. That's all I wanted to discuss or say. Now floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shea. Thank you very much. Very valuable. Now that we've finished our international panel, I mean, anybody from the attendees, anybody from the other panelists, do you have any questions that you want to present to Ms. Kirsten or Mr. Shea?
Question?
Yes, Mr. You can ask a question. Sure, please.
My question will be for Kirsten. I'm wondering about the ICC and its policy paper dated 2016, which is related to the environmental issues and trying to establish a linkage between environmental issues and international crime. So what do you think, how it can be effective on this ecocide issue and try to make the ecocide as an international crime under international law?
Thanks for that question. If I can just go ahead and answer it. I'm not sure if you want to collect a few, but indeed, in 2016, the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court issued a policy paper that outlines its approach to selecting the cases that it wants to pursue for investigation and possible prosecution. It in the paper, what was rather groundbreaking by ICC terms, indeed, is the fact that it explicitly mentioned that the Office of the Prosecutor wants to give special attention to crimes that are committed by the very virtue of destroying the environment, or that and effectively the crimes result in the said destruction of the environment. And this includes also explicit mention of illegal exploitation of natural resources and illegal land grabbing. Now, it's important to note that this is an internal policy document. It is the approach of the office under the current prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda. It doesn't, unfortunately, change the treaty, and therefore it doesn't change the legal framework under which the cases can be pursued. It could, if it were to reach a point of a case before the actual judges, it would be left open to the judges to interpret whether the crimes that fall under this determination would meet the threshold defined in the Rome Statute under the existing 4 crimes. So as I mentioned, the Rome Statute does account for environmental damage, but only in the situations of conflict, so war crimes. So these situations of illegal exploitation of natural resources would have to take place within the context of conflict. Secondly, the current prosecutor from the ICC will be stepping down soon. There are elections for the new prosecutor that are supposed to take place this month. We don't know what an incoming prosecutor will choose as her or his approach to investigating, prosecuting international crimes. Will this policy go forward into the future if there isn't very clear evidence from states and the international community that there is an appetite for taking this further? And then the third point, and again, I'm not trying to sound too negative here, but the third point is that since the paper was issued in 2016, there hasn't been very much to show for it in terms of the prosecutor's approach. Now, whether we can fault the office of the prosecutor for that, or the fact that the cases, or rather the communications about crimes that have come before the office have not actually had instances of land grabbing or resource depletion, that could be the case. It may just be a question of the cases coming before the court not actually having instances of potential environmental crimes as a result. But I think you're right in the way you framed your question to say that this provides an opening. It provides an opening because it's putting in the international debate about environmental crimes and ecocide a clear discussion place for this. And I think it also made some states, members of the ICC and not, a little bit more concerned sounds negative again, but a little bit more like, hey, maybe we should get involved with this and push forward for a clear definition, because then we'll have control over it. We'll have ownership. And this won't be some, again, to go back to some of the negative criticisms around the court, that this would be some rogue prosecutor deciding to pursue a single government for political reasons from an environmental criminal aspect. So those are my reflections on that initiative, but happy to address others. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions from the attendees or the other panelists?
Actually, I have another question.
Sure, please.
Kirsten's views on the possibility of the establishment of an international environmental court. I know that it's a very deep debate, but just want to learn her view on it. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. So I think it's quite interesting. I do think, I worked on the International Criminal Court for many years, and I think it's really not the best place to pursue this for all the reasons I mentioned during my presentation. And so starting a new court, I think there's more potential there. If we think about even if we take a step back and look at the ad hoc tribunals that have been created after the ICC was established, there's the triple IM looking at the international independent investigative international mechanism looking into Myanmar, or the one looking into Syria. There's been enough international support for new mechanisms to address international crimes when there wasn't an appetite for it to happen at the ICC. So you could see that possibly creating a new court, but with very exclusive, limited jurisdiction, might happen. So if you can pinpoint to a very explicit instance of willful environmental destruction that's limited in time, in territory, and possibly in actors involved, you may well see the General Assembly or even the UN Security Council say, hey, let's establish an ad hoc mechanism to address the environmental crimes here. Further than that, I think we really need to explore much further the debate about what ecocide or an international environmental crime would entail. And that's why I think this expert panel I mentioned at the end is really quite interesting. There's quite a number of legal scholars, people with quite a lot of experience in international criminal law who can really drive this discussion forward from a legal basis and maybe take some of the politics out of it and some of the economic concerns of like the business community and push that forward.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions to Kirsten or Mr. Sheh? I'd like to ask a question, Mr. Sheh. Now, in terms of poverty reduction, how effective is the transition from linear economy to circular economy? Like briefly, can you explain like the cornerstone steps that would have an impact on reduction of poverty?
Thank you. Really important question that cannot be really answered with a straightforward
yes.
discussion. Now, you see a couple of different things or a lot of different things are involved in this process of decoupling emissions or pollutions from growth or economic variables or economic performance of an economy. Now, poverty reduction requires, more equal distribution. Now, if the process of phasing out fossil fuel and then switching to a renewable energy-based production process involves ensuring property rights and also things being done in more equitable way, then it's possible. Now, the worry is from examples, if I draw from indigenous communities experienced in different countries, for example, in Canada,
yes,
Saskatchewan, I know.
I was trying to get that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That would be a great insight.
Yeah. So over there, state or that specific indigenous communities have their specific treaties with the federal and provincial government, under which whatever energy generation programs been undertaken within their territory will be owned by that community. That pretty much ensures the way out for that relatively or traditionally economically backward community, because it is ensuring energy security, and at the same time that energy is renewable energy with zero or really low emission levels, and that allows their economic integration and reconciliation with neighboring non-indigenous communities. And that model can be followed in different countries where income inequality is more systematic, like say a specific community is deprived of many essential facilities. Now, in many other countries where indigenous communities or those energy generation has been undertaken on the land owned originally by indigenous communities, I believe, say, because of weaker institutional framework, many of them were not really able to provide the benefit towards those mostly in need. And that's a problem. So we have good examples and potentially sound explanation that what institutional framework and sound enforcement of laws can enable one country to achieve their intended goals and another country not being able to do the same thing. Meaning, institutional framework must be supportive of enforcement of implementation and enforcement of climate change laws and litigation. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're now moving on to our national expert, and I'm going to switch to Turkish from here on. Thank you very much, Kirsten and Mr. Sheikh. Extremely valuable information, and it was an honor to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you.